I'm Nora Bennett, 29 years old, and on the morning of my birthday, I learned my family had thrown a surprise party just not for me and not by accident. I was at my kitchen table with my coffee when a notification blinked across my phone and pulled up a chandeliered room, a 3-tier cake with gold flecks, and my sister in a dress I'd only seen in storefront glass. The caption under the smiling faces said, "Celebrating the daughter who makes us proud," and the comments clapped along like a chorus that had practiced. I set my cup down and watched my breath steady in the reflection of the screen because I had promised myself I would not shake anymore. On the shelf behind me was a sealed envelope from my grandfather, and a name I could call if the day ever arrived when pretending was no longer kind. By nightfall, I knew that day had arrived. I was done making myself small to keep the peace. I tapped the album. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to prove your worth when someone brushed you aside, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I grew up in a house where effort was supposed to matter, where my grandfather taught me to measure twice and cut once, and to tell the truth even when it made the room go quiet. He built a pharmaceutical company out of an old garage and a notebook of sketches, and he let me sort tiny screws in baby food jars at the workbench when I was 8. My mother prized polish-ironed napkins, perfect photos, the right schools, and she loved saying a future doctor belonged on a pedestal because people need to see excellence. I learned a different kind of excellence. Mine had fewer spotlights and more spreadsheets, the kind that kept hospitals stocked when storms shut down highways, and nobody applauded because the shipment simply arrived on time. I was accepted to a top medical school in Baltimore, and the letter looked like sunlight on our kitchen table the day it came. The same week, Lauren's application stalled on a wait list, and the house went soft and frantic as my mother sat beside her, promising doors would open. I told everyone I had changed my mind, that medicine wasn't the right fit after all, and no one asked me twice. I pivoted to operations, paid my rent with 2 part-time jobs and an internship that turned into work I loved, then earned my MBA at night while learning how to negotiate freight rates and reroute entire networks with a phone call. During the shortages, I leveraged vendor relationships and kept 17 hospitals flush with protective gear by moving inventory like pieces on a chessboard. When the quarterly report showed millions saved, the room clapped for the company, and I went home and did laundry. The gap between our lives widened in little ways and expensive ones. A red bow luxury sedan for Lauren to support her residency, even though she was still in rotation. A crisp text for me on graduation day that read, "Congrats," followed by an e-gift card that covered a pair of flats if I shopped carefully. Lauren moved into a downtown high-rise with a view of the harbor, and when the landlord asked for a guarantor, my mother looked at me as if the decision had already been made. I signed because I believed family was a promise you kept, and because I thought some seasons of generosity were temporary. The late fees came anyway, along with the polite email reminders, and I covered what I could to keep my credit from bleeding. Granddad never called me practical the way others did, like it meant unremarkable. He used the word like praise. He read my graduate thesis on pharmaceutical distribution and smiled at the parts where I shaved minutes off a process and turned them into days by year's end. He kept telling me there was a difference between being quiet and being invisible, and that some truths belonged to us until we were ready to speak them. A few months before he passed, he closed his study door and gave me the envelope with my name on it, his hand steady on top of mine. "Use this when it will do the most good," he said, and I understood he wasn't asking me to hurt anyone. He was asking me not to let harm continue. That morning, the birthday with someone else's candles, I was in a small walk-up with crooked sunlight on the floorboards and a second-hand couch that creaked when I shifted. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I had made peace with the way my life fit together. A modest car that started every time a savings account I guarded like a small flame. A job that made sense to me, even if it didn't photograph well. The photos from the party looked like another planet. White tablecloths, a rented marquee, cousins I hadn't seen in years, even our old neighbor who used to ask my mother why I couldn't be more like my sister. I scrolled slowly because I wanted to be sure I wasn't imagining it, because sometimes you tell yourself it's not as bad as it looks, that a missed call is an oversight and not a message. The faces were so bright, so certain. My phone buzzed again as new comments stacked up, each one a tidy assumption about worth and how it should be decorated. The air in my apartment felt thinner, and I realized I was standing, even though I hadn't meant to. I thought about the night I boxed up Granddad's slide rule and his worn leather notebook, and promised I would do right by his name, not to win a contest I never entered, but to protect what he built. My hand went to the envelope on the shelf, the paper edges softened by time, and I felt the calm that comes when a decision has already been made. I was not going to argue in a comment thread about whether I counted. I was going to stop pretending I didn't know what was true. I took one last look at my quiet kitchen, at the coffee cooling in its ring on the table, and then I turned back to my phone and the bright world inside it. The album's first image showed the cake from above, a gold script that said exactly who deserved celebration. Beneath it, my mother's caption glowed like a plaque. I tapped the screen and opened the comments, waiting to see which of them would tell me plainly what I had been for years, to the people who should have known me best. When I tapped the album, the first picture opened full screen. There was my mother, my aunts, and nearly every cousin I had standing around a cake layered with gold leaf and pale roses. Right in the center, Lauren held a champagne flute, her smile wide, the kind she used when she wanted the world to see how perfect things looked. The timestamp on the corner told me everything. Yesterday evening, March 14th, my birthday. They'd thrown the party that night under the lights strung across our backyard, the same space where I used to help Granddad build models of shipping routes when I was a kid. The comments moved faster than I could read. So proud of her. Finally, a Bennett worth celebrating. Every sentence carried the same meaning that I wasn't. I stared at the screen until the glow blurred, then typed 2 words that felt harmless enough. Niece cake. 30 seconds later, Mom replied, "At least someone deserves the effort." The words settled into the silence of my apartment like a door slamming shut. I told myself the favoritism didn't sting anymore, that I'd learned to expect it and move on. But there it was again, displayed for everyone to see, proof that no matter how much I accomplished, it would never be enough. I tried to swallow the ache by reminding myself what I had: a good job, independence, a record I'd built on my own. Still, the sting of that post reached places I thought were long healed. I scrolled through more pictures: our Uncle Richard, who hadn't returned my calls in years, laughing beside my mother. Cousins who'd skipped my MBA graduation, standing shoulder to shoulder with Lauren. Even Mrs. Sullivan from next door was there, a woman who once asked my mom why I couldn't be more like the doctor. The screen filled with a lifetime of invisible moments, every omission gathered in one neat album. I set the phone down, but the words kept echoing. "Real career," my mother had said in one of her earlier posts about Lauren. She'd used that phrase more than once, when Lauren got her first lab coat when she moved into her apartment, when I mentioned a promotion that came with longer hours but better pay. It wasn't that Mom didn't understand what I did, she just didn't see it. To her, supply chain management sounded like counting boxes, not coordinating entire hospital networks. When I was younger, she used to introduce us like this: Lauren, my future doctor, and Nora, my practical one. Practical spoken kindly, but landing like a ceiling. I built a career under that word, paid my own tuition, and carried myself with the sort of steadiness that doesn't make headlines. But that birthday morning showed me how small they still wanted me to be. After lunch, my phone buzzed again, another post from Mom, a close-up of the cake this time with the caption, "So blessed to have a daughter who makes us proud every single day." I could almost hear her voice, that careful brightness she used when she wanted to sound modest while showing off. I looked at my reflection in the black screen, wondering what made pride so selective. Lauren's success had always been the family's favorite story. When she was accepted into medical school, there were banners, catered dinners, even an engraved bracelet she still wore to every family gathering. I didn't begrudge her that. She'd worked for it. But no one noticed how that same year I'd been accepted to Johns Hopkins with a full scholarship. I'd turned it down quietly so Mom wouldn't spend nights worrying that her favorite daughter's waitlist notice meant failure. I told everyone I wanted a different path. That decision rewrote the shape of our lives. Lauren went off to school with applause. I took a warehouse job while finishing undergrad. Every holiday dinner afterward became a polite audit of how our doctor was progressing and whether our practical one had found something serious to do. I told myself love just looked different for each of us, but sitting there reading those comments, it was hard to believe. In the years that followed, my contributions rarely earned space in family conversations. When the pandemic hit and medical supply chains collapsed, my team's overnight reroutes kept 17 hospitals stocked with protective gear. The memo went company-wide, but at home, Mom simply said, "Lauren's been so brave working in the ICU." I didn't correct her. I never did. Money told the story clearer than words. Lauren's graduation gift was a brand new sedan wrapped in a ribbon so wide it brushed the driveway. Mine had been an email gift card worth $50. When I asked for a small loan once, just until my first paycheck cleared, Mom sighed like I'd asked for the moon. "You need to learn independence, Nora. Your sister has real stress." I thanked her anyway and hung up before the heat in my eyes could fall. It wasn't just gifts, it was how the family defined responsibility. Lauren's rent at the Harbor apartment came with a bow-tied temporary guarantee signed by me. Each late payment landed on my record, and I covered them because letting her credit collapse would have looked like cruelty. The total crept past $20,000, and still she called it a favor between sisters. Mom called it family helping family. By evening, I stopped pretending to work and sat by the window, the city's noise floating up from the street below. For the first time in a long while, I thought about Granddad's study, the leather chair that smelled of pipe tobacco, and the sound of his old clock marking the quiet. I could still see his hands sliding that thick envelope across the desk to me, his voice low. "You'll know when to use it." He had said it like a promise. Back then, I assumed he meant something sentimental, a letter, or maybe advice he didn't want read until later. I hadn't opened it since the day of his funeral. The envelope stayed sealed through every slight, every whispered comparison, every reminder that I wasn't the one worth celebrating. But that night, the memory of his eyes clear, knowing, kept me company. The next morning, the comments on the post had doubled. Someone from my office had tagged me with a question mark. Another coworker sent a message asking if I'd seen the family news. I typed a polite reply and closed the app. The damage wasn't in the words themselves, but in how public they were. Every classmate, every colleague, every neighbor now had front-row seats to a performance that had run my whole life. I stared at my phone until my reflection came into focus, then scrolled through my contacts until I reached a name I hadn't used in years. Thomas Avery. The man who'd managed Granddad's estate. The one who'd mailed me a card after the funeral that said, "If you ever need clarity, my door is open." I hesitated only a moment before pressing call, then ended it before the first ring. It wasn't time. Not yet. Hours later, I checked my email. A new message sat in my inbox with the subject line, "Lease renewal urgent." I opened it and saw the landlord's request for updated guarantor paperwork. Lauren's name was listed as tenant, mine as financial backer. The deadline was 2 weeks away. I leaned back in my chair and watched the city lights start to blink on across the water. Somewhere on another screen, Lauren was probably preparing for her next photo shoot or medical announcement. The irony settled slow and sharp. The family celebrating her success had no idea she couldn't even qualify for her own lease. They didn't know how many late payments I'd shielded from collections or how much of her polished image rested on my credit score. For years, I'd kept those facts to myself, thinking silence was loyalty. Now it felt like surrender. I closed the email without replying, folded my hands, and tried to steady my breath. Granddad's envelope waited in the top drawer of my desk, just where I'd left it. My fingers brushed its edge, the paper soft from age. I didn't open it, not yet, but for the first time, I wanted to. The hum of the refrigerator filled the apartment, a small, steady sound that matched the beat of my pulse. Outside, the sky turned the color of pewter, and the streetlights flickered on. I poured another cup of coffee, sat back down, and looked at the unopened envelope. Tomorrow I decided I'd call Thomas Avery. I didn't know it then, but that single decision, the quiet click of one phone call, would be the start of everything that came after. The morning I finally called Thomas Avery, the sky was washed in gray, the kind that makes the city sound quieter than it is. My voice trembled on the first words introducing myself, explaining that I was Harold Bennett's granddaughter. There was no pause on the other end, only the steady sound of recognition. "I've been expecting your call, Ms. Bennett," he said. "Your grandfather asked me to reach out when you were ready." The weight of those words filled the room. For 3 years I had carried that sealed envelope like a secret too heavy to name. Now the man who had drawn up my grandfather's final papers was speaking as though the story had already been written, waiting for me to turn the page. He asked if I could meet him at his office that afternoon. I agreed before my fear could answer first. Thomas's office was downtown in one of those old buildings with brass elevators and names etched into glass doors. The air smelled faintly of leather and paper, the kind of place where nothing rushed. When I walked in, he rose from behind a desk scattered with files and nodded once like someone greeting an old promise. "You look just like him," he said softly. He motioned for me to sit and opened a folder already resting at the center of his desk. "Your grandfather trusted very few people," he began. "He knew what your mother and sister were capable of long before they acted. He left protections in place, but he wanted you to be the one to decide when to use them." I listened as he laid out what he had known all along, that the will everyone believed in was forged. My mother and sister had used a stolen office key to enter this very building 3 days after Granddad's death. The surveillance footage was stored in his safe untouched since the day it was recorded. They had filed a version of the will notarized by a woman whose license had expired 2 years earlier. And that wasn't all. Thomas handed me a document stamped with the company's seal. "These are financial statements from Bennett Therapeutics," he said. "Over the past 3 years, your sister has authorized transfers from company accounts to her personal LLC. The total exceeds $2 million. The numbers blurred for a moment before settling into focus. "Why hasn't anyone stopped her?" I asked quietly. "Because until now," he replied, "no one with authority knew the truth." He pulled another folder forward thicker than the rest. "Your grandfather anticipated all of this. He created a trust separate from the company's holdings. Within that trust is a clause called the integrity provision. Any beneficiary found guilty of fraud or misconduct automatically forfeits their rights. In that event, full ownership transfers to the contingent heir." He looked up. "That heir is you." The room seemed to tilt. I sat back, letting the words settle around me, hearing them but not yet believing. "He wanted you to have the choice," Thomas said. "He knew the day would come when they'd push you too far." I thought about the Facebook post, the laughter, the way Mom had written someone who deserves it. The moment had already come. Thomas leaned forward. "There's an event next week," he said. "A product launch. Your sister plans to announce herself as the visionary behind a new medication and the company's upcoming public offering. 200 investors, press coverage, the entire industry watching. That will be your moment." He slid an envelope across the desk. "Inside are your grandfather's original documents and the court filings prepared for that day. You won't need to speak much. Just show up and let the truth do the work." I took the envelope carefully, the seal still unbroken. It felt heavier than the one I had kept all these years. "Why not reveal this sooner?" I asked. Thomas smiled faintly. "Because justice without understanding looks like revenge. He wanted you to understand who you were first." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with both envelopes in front of me, the one from Granddad and the one Thomas had given me. The streetlight outside flickered through the blinds, striping the table in gold and gray. My hands hesitated over the first envelope, the one Granddad had sealed himself. When I finally broke it open, the air seemed to still. Inside was a letter written in his careful handwriting. He spoke of how he had watched me all my life, how he'd seen me quietly choose decency over recognition, how he'd noticed what I sacrificed so my sister could shine. He wrote that real leadership wasn't about applause, it was about courage when no one was watching. And then he wrote a line that I would never forget. "There will come a time when you must decide whether silence is strength or surrender. Choose strength." By the time I finished reading, the words had blurred behind tears I hadn't realized were there. I folded the letter back into its envelope and set it beside the one from Thomas. The decision was no longer about whether to act, it was about how. The next morning, an email arrived from Lauren. "Need you to re-sign the guarantee paperwork for my lease. Landlord's giving me grief again. She ended it with a heart emoji, as if we hadn't spoken in weeks. I stared at the screen and pictured her penthouse view, the rent I'd covered, the bills she'd ignored. I thought about the integrity clause, about the way Granddad's eyes had looked when he said, "You'll know when to use it." I drafted a reply but didn't send it. Instead, I called Thomas. If I don't renew the lease, I asked what happens. He didn't hesitate. "The lease will terminate in 10 days. It's your right to withdraw. You're under no obligation to continue supporting her." His calm tone carried a weight that steadied me. "Then I won't," I said. "I'm done being her safety net." After we hung up, I opened the document Lauren had attached, the renewal agreement, waiting for my signature. My name sat neatly beside hers, tied to every payment she had missed. I scrolled to the bottom and clicked decline. The system asked if I wanted to provide a reason. I typed guarantor, no longer responsible for tenant's obligations. Then I pressed send. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet that follows a decision made from truth rather than fear. It wasn't anger, it was relief, clean and absolute. I sat back and watched the confirmation email arrive in my inbox. The lease would expire on March 30th. That evening, I walked through my apartment, noticing how ordinary everything looked. The coffee mug on the counter, the stack of papers by the door, but somehow everything felt different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was space wide and clear. My phone buzzed with another message from Lauren. "Thank you for handling the paperwork. You're a lifesaver." I let the message sit unread. Somewhere downtown, she was probably rehearsing her speech for the product launch, unaware that her world was already shifting beneath her. When I finally turned off the lights, the city outside was still awake, headlights sliding across the walls like moving water. I thought about Granddad's study, about the way his desk lamp had cast the same warm glow on the night he handed me that first envelope. His voice echoed in memory, steady, patient. "Let them believe they've won. Then when the time comes, tell the truth." The time was almost here. In just a few days, 200 people would sit in a ballroom and watch my sister stand beneath the company logo, claiming a legacy she'd stolen. And I would be there too, in the back of the room, holding everything my grandfather had left for this exact moment. I closed my eyes, the image already clear, the stage lights, the applause, and the sound of silence right before the truth steps into the room. The week before the launch moved like something measured in slow motion. Every morning my inbox filled with updates about the event copied to me by mistake from the company's internal mailing list I still had access to. Lauren's name appeared in bold type at the top of every message, Dr. Nora Bennett, CEO. There were photo mock-ups of the ballroom stage, a schedule marked by the hour, and the guest list that stretched over 6 pages. Each detail carried the same message: it would be her grand performance. I hadn't spoken to my mother since that Facebook post. When she finally called, her tone was polished and bright, as though nothing had happened. "Your sister has a huge announcement coming," she said. "She wants the family to be there to show support. You'll come, won't you?" I kept my voice even. "I'll be there," I said. She sounded relieved, mistaking my calm for surrender. "Good. And wear something elegant. This is a very big day for her." When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long time. The truth about what Lauren and Mom had done sat in a folder on my kitchen table, labeled and ready. Thomas had told me that everything was in motion. The court injunction was being prepared, and the investors who would matter most already knew to stay in their seats once the reveal began. All I had to do was show up. The night before the event, I opened my closet and ran my hand along the few dresses hanging there. I chose a navy suit instead, the same one I'd worn to my last major conference, tailored neatly and modest enough to disappear into a crowd. I pressed the lapels flat and packed the envelope inside my bag. It felt heavier than paper should, as though it carried the weight of every time I'd bitten back words that deserved to be said. On the morning of the launch, the city was already stirring by sunrise. I walked to the window, coffee in hand, watching the streaks of light hit the harbor. I tried to steady my breathing. Somewhere across town, Lauren was probably surrounded by stylists and publicists, preparing for her moment under the lights. I wasn't there to ruin her. I was there to tell the truth. The Ritz-Carlton's ballroom smelled faintly of lilies and polished silver. I arrived early just after 10, slipping into the back row as crews tested microphones and photographers adjusted angles. The stage was set with a wide backdrop of the company logo, Bennett Therapeutics, bold gleaming permanent, at least for now. By 11:30, every seat was filled. Investors in tailored suits spoke in low voices. Journalists whispered over their notepads and camera operators crouched near the aisles. Lauren appeared from the side entrance, radiant under the lights, wearing an ivory dress that shimmered as she moved. Mom followed closely behind her, posture stiff with pride. When Lauren saw me, she offered a practiced smile. "You came," she said softly, as if surprised. "Of course," I answered. "Family always shows up." She touched my arm, her tone sugar-sweet. "Try not to distract anyone, okay? Just enjoy the show." I nodded and found my seat again, table 24, tucked between catering staff and a service exit. It was exactly where she thought I belonged. When the lights dimmed, the host introduced her as the youngest female CEO in the company's history. Applause swept the room as she walked to the podium. Behind her, a massive screen displayed her photo and the words, "Continuing a Legacy." The irony wasn't lost on me. "Good morning," Lauren began. Her voice carried that perfect mix of confidence and warmth that photographs well. "Today we celebrate not just innovation, but the spirit of family and determination that built this company." She paused for effect. "My grandfather's dream lives on through our work." I glanced at my phone. The time read 11:33. Thomas had said he'd arrive at 11:47 on the dot. 14 minutes. I felt the envelope inside my bag, its edges pressing against my side like a pulse. Lauren continued talking about breakthrough trials and an upcoming IPO, words that shimmered on the surface but held nothing underneath. When she mentioned her leadership team, I noticed Dr. Alan Pierce in the front row, his face tight, arms crossed. He'd been with the company since the beginning. His eyes flicked briefly toward me, then to the clock. Halfway through her speech, Lauren smiled toward the audience. "Before we continue, I'd like to introduce someone special," she said. "My sister Nora is here today." The spotlight swept across the room until it landed squarely on my table. Conversations hushed. "Nora works in—" "Well, something technical," she said, laughing lightly. "She's the numbers side of our family. We're all so proud she could make it." A few polite chuckles rippled through the room. My mother's face glowed with satisfaction, as if the small humiliation were an inside joke only she understood. I kept my expression steady, lifted my chin, and nodded toward the stage. "Thank you, Lauren," I said, just loud enough to be heard. The silence that followed was fragile. Then a man near the front, Daniel Ruiz, rose to his feet. "Excuse me," he said, "is this the same Nora Bennett who published the logistics paper in the Wharton Journal?" A low murmur spread through the room. "That study changed how we manage hospital distribution," he added. "Brilliant work." Lauren's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she found it again. "Ah, yes. My sister has always been very organized," she replied. Her tone stretched thin. "But today is about medical innovation." She tried to steer the room back, but Daniel's words lingered. A few investors exchanged glances, the kind that ask quiet questions. At that moment, the ballroom doors opened. Thomas Avery stepped inside, 2 associates, trailing behind him, each carrying a banker's box. The sight drew murmurs from the audience. Lauren froze mid-sentence. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice higher than before. Thomas moved toward the stage with calm precision. "Apologies for the interruption," he said evenly. "I'm Thomas Avery, legal counsel to the late Harold Bennett." He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked directly at her. "There's a matter of documentation that requires immediate attention." Mom hurried to the microphone. "This is highly inappropriate," she snapped. "You're disrupting an official event." Thomas met her gaze without flinching. "Mrs. Bennett, I believe you and your daughter are already familiar with these documents," he said, lifting a folder from the box. "The real last will and testament of Harold Bennett." A hush fell over the room. Someone's phone camera clicked. Lauren laughed, brittle and thin. "That's absurd. My grandfather's will was settled years ago." Thomas unfolded the papers and held them up for the audience to see. "The document your daughter submitted was forged using an expired notary license. Security footage confirms the forgery took place 3 days after Mr. Bennett's passing. Mom's hand shot out, clutching the microphone. "This man is lying!" Thomas turned to the audience. "We also have forensic handwriting analysis and bank statements showing more than $2 million transferred from company accounts to an LLC under Ms. Bennett's name. The evidence has already been filed with the Delaware Court of Chancery." Gasps filled the room. Reporters raised their cameras. The air felt electric, alive with disbelief. Lauren's face drained of color. "You can't prove," she started, but Thomas's associate connected a laptop to the screen behind her. The next slide flashed across it, side-by-side signatures highlighted and matched, followed by a time-stamped security video of Lauren and Mom entering Thomas's office after hours. Every whisper in the room seemed to land on her shoulders. I stayed seated, hands clasped in my lap, watching her world bend under the weight of her own choices. Thomas's voice carried above the noise. "Under the terms of the verified will, ownership of Bennett Therapeutics passes entirely to Ms. Nora Bennett." He looked toward me. "Ms. Bennett, would you please join us on stage?" The room turned as one. I stood slowly, the carpet muffling the sound of my heels as I walked forward. Lauren stepped back, shaking her head. "This isn't real," she whispered. When I reached the stage, Thomas placed the folder in my hands. "Your grandfather left this company in good hands," he said quietly. "Yours." The room erupted in flashes and murmurs. I looked out at the crowd faces of strangers, investors, employees who had worked under my sister's name. Somewhere in the sea of people, Daniel Ruiz was smiling faintly, as if he'd known this moment was coming all along. Lauren's voice cracked behind me. "You planned this," she said. "You waited until Thomas interrupted gently. No, Ms. Bennett, your actions planned it for you." He turned toward the audience once more. "The court has issued an injunction freezing company operations until the transition is complete. Any attempt to interfere will constitute obstruction." Mom reached for Lauren's arm, but security was already moving closer. The spotlight still burned on us, catching the dust in the air like glitter. I took the microphone from the podium and steadied it in my hand. "Bennett Therapeutics was built on truth," I said, my voice clear. "And that's where it will return." The words hung there simple and final. Behind me, the screen still glowed with my grandfather's signature, steady, certain, unmistakably his. When the lights shifted and the cameras clicked, I felt the room shift too. Years of silence broke all at once, replaced by the sound of truth taking its first breath. I didn't look back as I left the stage, but I could feel their eyes following me. The investors, the journalists, my mother, my sister. Ahead of me, Thomas waited by the door, a quiet nod of reassurance. By the end of that afternoon, nothing about our family or the company would ever be the same. Security escorted Lauren and Mom out of the ballroom while the crowd buzzed like a hive. Reporters shouted questions, flashes popped from every corner, and I stood beneath the company logo that had once been hers. The words on the screen, "Bennett Therapeutics built on integrity," looked almost new again. I turned to Thomas, who was already collecting the signed injunctions from his associates. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "Now, Ms. Bennett, the company begins to heal." Within an hour, the ballroom had emptied except for a few board members who lingered by the stage. Margaret Cole approached me first, her expression measured but kind. "We should schedule an emergency meeting," she said. "There's a great deal to sort through." Behind her, Dr. Pierce adjusted his glasses and gave a small nod of approval. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. "He trusted you for a reason." The words landed softly, like a benediction. We gathered in a side conference room, still smelling of catered coffee and fresh paper. Thomas spread out documents across the polished table: court orders, shareholder statements, letters of acknowledgement from the reinstated board. Margaret took the seat at the head, though her eyes stayed fixed on me. Effective immediately, she said, "You are the acting CEO of Bennett Therapeutics until the board's formal confirmation." I hesitated only long enough to steady my hands. "Then let's start." Dr. Pierce walked us through the damage. "The research," Lauren announced, "is nowhere near ready," he said. Phase 2 trials just began. If she'd moved forward with investors, it would have been catastrophic. The numbers followed false expense reports, inflated budgets, internal payments coded as consulting fees. The total losses exceeded $5 million. My chest tightened as the weight of it settled. "We'll make it right," I said. "Every cent." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "The FBI will handle the criminal side. Our job is to stabilize the company." He turned to me. "And to protect your grandfather's name." I nodded, feeling both exhaustion and resolve. Margaret looked down the table. "You'll have our full support, Nora. We should prepare a statement before the press writes its own." That night, I returned home to an apartment still half lit from the morning I left. My bag hit the counter, the envelope still inside, though its work was done. I poured a glass of water and let the silence expand. The day had felt like a lifetime. On my phone, the first headlines had already appeared: "Fake CEO exposed in live investor event." The story was everywhere. Beneath the article's photo comments streamed like wildfire. Some pitied Lauren, others praised me. I scrolled until the screen blurred, then set it face down. By morning, the company's inbox overflowed with messages, employees uncertain if they still had jobs, vendors asking whether contracts would be honored. I went in early, the first to arrive. The security guard at the front desk straightened when he saw me. "Morning, Ms. Bennett," he said, the title still strange in his mouth. The building smelled of coffee and dust. In the lobby, someone had already taken down the framed photo of Lauren in her lab coat. The empty hook on the wall gleamed under the lights. When the rest of the staff arrived, whispers filled the hallways. Faces peeked from office doors, hesitant but hopeful. I called an all-hands meeting in the atrium at 9 sharp. "We're still standing," I began. "And we're going to rebuild this company the right way. Every salary, every contract, every lab result, everything will be transparent from today forward." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Dr. Pierce started to clap, slow and deliberate. One by one, the others joined in. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just steady, enough to remind me that truth could build something stronger than fear. Over the next week, Thomas's legal team combed through years of records while the board worked to stabilize finances. I signed my first official order as acting CEO, a full internal audit. Margaret approved it within the hour. Daniel Ruiz stopped by the office one afternoon, a calm presence amid the storm. "The investors are watching how you handle this," he said, "and they like what they see." He smiled. "If you ever need backing, call me." That night, as I prepared to leave, an email from the property manager appeared in my inbox. Notification of lease termination for tenant Nora Bennett, effective in 72 hours. I read it twice, the words clinical and final. My decision not to renew had triggered the process automatically. Thomas had been right, justice sometimes needed no announcement. It just unfolded on its own. The next morning, Mom called. Her voice was brittle, the edge of panic just beneath the surface. "They're saying Lauren could face charges," she said. "You have to help her, Nora. She's your sister." I leaned against the desk, looking out over the skyline. "She made her choices, Mom." Silence stretched between us. "You sound just like your grandfather," she whispered finally. "He was always so stubborn about consequences." I didn't answer. The line went quiet before she hung up. 2 days later, the headlines changed again. FBI investigation confirms forgery and embezzlement at Bennett Therapeutics. The article included a photo of Lauren being escorted from her penthouse, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Mom followed close behind, her expression a mix of disbelief and regret. I closed the laptop and turned back to the paperwork waiting on my desk. There were employee contracts to review, investor calls to schedule a company to rebuild. That afternoon, Dr. Pierce knocked softly on my door. "We found something else," he said. He placed a folder in front of me, more unauthorized transfers, more hidden accounts. The total loss was higher than we thought. I exhaled slowly. "We'll fix it," I said. He nodded, one step at a time. Later that week, the board held an official vote. Margaret read the results aloud, unanimous confirmation. My name was entered as CEO of Bennett Therapeutics. Applause filled the room, gentle but resolute. Thomas stood near the doorway, his expression proud but weary. When the meeting ended, he handed me a small box wrapped in paper the color of cream. "Your grandfather left this for you," he said. Inside was his old slide rule and a note. "Build it better this time." That night, I walked through the lab floor after everyone had gone home. Machines hummed softly in the dark, a rhythm that sounded like endurance. I paused by the window, looking down at the city below the same skyline Lauren had once claimed as her own. It felt different now, quieter, honest. My phone vibrated on the table. A new message from the landlord-tenant vacated. Property cleared. I stared at the words until they settled. Across the street, a delivery truck rolled past its headlights, glinting off the glass doors of our building. Change had already begun. When I finally shut off the lights and locked the office, the hallways felt less hollow. Every echo carried something familiar. Granddad's calm, Thomas's steady guidance, the quiet resilience I'd mistaken for weakness for too many years. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't running from my family's shadow. I was walking toward my own beginning. Still, I knew what waited ahead. Legal hearings, media scrutiny, hard choices that would test every ounce of resolve I had left. But as I crossed the parking lot, the city lights reflected in the building's glass like tiny stars, and I understood what Granddad meant when he said patience was power. Tomorrow, the real work would start, and this time, it would start with truth. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of long days and longer nights. Every morning I arrived before sunrise, unlocking the glass doors that once opened for someone else. The company was quieter now, stripped of the performance it had worn for years. Employees who had once whispered in corners began to speak plainly. Meetings ended on time. Reports came in without fear. Slowly the building started to feel alive again. The first major audit results arrived that Monday. Thomas and Margaret joined me in the boardroom, papers stacked in careful piles. "It's worse than we thought," Margaret said, sliding a summary across the table. Lauren had funneled nearly $5 million through 12 shell accounts. Some transactions were disguised as consulting fees, others labeled as medical outreach. The trail stretched across 3 countries. I traced the lines on the page until they blurred. "Will she face charges for all of this?" I asked quietly. Thomas nodded. "Federal prosecutors are already reviewing the evidence." That afternoon, the first call came from a news outlet requesting comment. I declined politely, choosing silence over spectacle. By evening, the headlines had written themselves, "Disgraced CEO, under investigation. Family scandal unfolds at Bennett Therapeutics." The story spread faster than we could contain it. I focused on the only thing I could control, fixing what was broken. We launched a full ethics review, replacing every vendor tied to fraudulent invoices. Dr. Pierce rebuilt the research timeline, stripping away the exaggerations Lauren had fed to investors. "We're 18 months behind," he told me, "but at least now we know where we stand." Honesty sounded like progress. I approved additional funding for the lab team and told him to move carefully, not quickly. The shareholders grumbled, but transparency had to come first. Mom called 2 days later. Her voice shook between anger and disbelief. "They arrested her," she said. "The FBI took her from the condo. You could have stopped this, Nora. You could have protected your sister." I sat at my desk looking out over the city. "Mom, she forged documents, stole money, and used the company like a personal account." She started to cry, sharp, uneven breaths that dissolved into silence. "You don't understand," she said finally. "She was supposed to have everything. And I was supposed to have nothing I asked, but the line had already gone dead." The next morning, Thomas arrived with a folder marked Case Updates. Inside were the official charges, wire fraud, embezzlement, forgery. Each count felt like a line drawn between the person I'd grown up with and the stranger she'd become. He set the file aside and studied me carefully. "How are you holding up?" I exhaled. "I don't know yet." He nodded once. "Then just keep working. It's the best thing you can do." By Friday, the company's social media feed was full of messages, some supportive, some cruel, most curious. One comment caught my eye. The quiet one saved the legacy. I didn't respond, but I printed it out and pinned it inside my office cabinet. It reminded me that silence wasn't always weakness. The following week, Daniel Ruiz returned with a proposal. "Investors trust stability," he said, unfolding a chart of projected growth. You're rebuilding credibility faster than anyone expected. If we position the company as a model for transparency, we can turn this around." His calm confidence filled the room. "We'll rebuild," I said. "But we'll do it the right way." He smiled. "That's why people are starting to believe in you." One afternoon, the security desk called to tell me my mother was downstairs. I hesitated before agreeing to see her. She looked smaller than I remembered, wrapped in a gray coat, eyes rimmed red. "I don't recognize this world anymore," she said as we sat in the lobby. "They're saying terrible things about us." "They're saying the truth," I replied. Her gaze dropped to her folded hands. "She's facing prison, Nora. You can't really want that." "I didn't choose it," I said softly. "She did." Mom leaned forward, her tone desperate. "Your grandfather's company will survive, but what about family? What about forgiveness?" I met her eyes. "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting Mom, and I can't rebuild what you refuse to protect." She flinched, then rose to leave. At the door, she turned back once. "You sound just like him," she said. "Always so sure the rules matter more than love." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. That evening, Thomas called from his office. "The plea hearing is scheduled for next month," he said. "Lauren's lawyer is negotiating for reduced time in exchange for full cooperation." I listened in silence as he outlined the terms. "Your mother will likely face probation," he added gently. "Accessory to forgery." My throat tightened, but the words came steady. Let the law take its course. Over the next few days, news outlets began publishing deeper investigations. Former employees came forward sharing stories of favoritism and intimidation. A nurse from a partner hospital described how Lauren had claimed credit for her work. Another article exposed the Mercedes and penthouse, both bought with company funds. The public's sympathy vanished. Every headline echoed the same truth: my sister's empire had been built on sand. Through it all, the company's staff stayed steady. We celebrated small victories: an on-time shipment, a recovered contract, a new client who cited integrity as the reason for joining us. One evening, as the sun fell behind the skyline, Dr. Pierce stopped by my office. "It feels different here now," he said. "People aren't afraid anymore." He smiled faintly. "That's leadership, Nora." I didn't have words, so I just nodded. The following week, Thomas sent over the final audit report. At the end of the document, a note from the financial team read, "All accounts verified, all assets secure." For the first time in months, I closed my laptop before dark. I walked through the quiet corridors, past framed photos of scientists and founders, and paused by the blank space where Lauren's portrait had hung. The wall looked cleaner without it. The next morning, Margaret called an early meeting. "We've recovered nearly everything," she said, "and the board has approved reinstating research bonuses for the staff. They earned it." Applause rippled through the room. It was the first real sound of hope I'd heard in a long while. When the meeting ended, Thomas approached with another envelope, thinner this time. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this, once you'd made it through the storm," he said. Inside was a note written in his familiar hand. "Justice isn't loud, Nora. It's steady. Keep building." I folded it carefully and placed it inside my planner. Later that afternoon, I received a message from the hospital director where Lauren had trained. "Termination effective immediately for ethical violations." I read it twice before forwarding it to Thomas for the records. The life she'd built on borrowed credit had finally come undone. That evening, the city lights shimmered against the office windows. I stood by the glass, watching the reflection of the Bennett Therapeutics logo glowing behind me. The company was smaller now, simpler, but it felt real honest in a way it hadn't been for years. My phone buzzed once more, a text from an unknown number. "I'm sorry." The area code was Lauren's old one. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned it face down on the desk. Some apologies arrived too late to fix what they'd broken. As the office emptied for the night, I switched off the lights and walked through the hall one last time. The building hummed, quietly alive with the sound of work being done the right way. Outside, the air carried the faint scent of rain, clean and cold. I tightened my coat and stepped into the evening, the door clicking shut behind me. Tomorrow there would be more meetings, more rebuilding, more proof that truth could outlast deception. But for the first time, I believed we were finally moving toward peace. The courthouse in downtown Wilmington was an old building with columns that carried the smell of rain and paper. When I arrived that morning, the steps were lined with reporters' cameras already waiting. Thomas met me at the door, his briefcase tucked under one arm. "They'll try to get a reaction," he warned gently. "Just stay quiet." I nodded, grateful for his calm. The hearing wasn't mine to speak in, but I had promised myself I would be there to see the truth through to its end. Inside the courtroom was smaller than I expected, almost intimate. The wooden benches creaked as people took their seats. Company staff, local journalists, a few former investors who had lost money during Lauren's short tenure. The judge entered without ceremony. Across the aisle, my mother sat behind the defense table, her hair pinned neatly, eyes downcast. Next to her, Lauren stared straight ahead, jaw-tight wrists resting in her lap. She looked nothing like the woman who once filled stages with confidence. The prosecutor began with a calm summary: forged documents, stolen funds, false reporting. The facts were steady, unembellished, impossible to deny. When they played the security footage of her breaking into Thomas's office, a collective murmur swept through the room. I kept my gaze fixed on the table in front of me, the grain of the wood steady beneath my fingertips. When it was Lauren's turn to speak, she rose slowly. "I made mistakes," she said, her voice quiet, the edges uneven. "I thought I was protecting what belonged to me." The judge listened without expression. "Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" he asked. She nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. I do now." It was the first honest sentence I'd heard her say in years. The sentencing was swift. 7 years in federal custody with the possibility of early release for cooperation. My mother received probation, community service, and a fine. As the gavel fell, the sound was smaller than I imagined, almost fragile. Lauren turned once before they led her away. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but no words came. The bailiff guided her toward the side door, and she vanished into the corridor. When it was over, I stepped outside with Thomas into the sharp autumn air. The cameras were waiting lenses gleaming like eyes. One reporter called out, "Ms. Bennett, will you forgive your family?" I paused long enough to meet her gaze. "That's not my decision to make anymore," I said quietly. Then I walked past them, the sound of questions fading behind me. In the weeks that followed, the company kept me busy. Barrett and Dr. Pierce managed the labs while I handled public relations and investor calls. Each conversation began the same way, with sympathy, then relief, then cautious trust. "You've restored faith in the brand," Daniel told me during one late-night meeting. "People see Bennett Therapeutics differently now." He leaned back in his chair. "You've done what most couldn't, turn scandal into credibility." I gave a small smile. We just told the truth. By December, the company's reputation had stabilized. Stock prices rose quietly. Our first research milestone since the audit was complete, and Dr. Pierce's team presented clean, verifiable data. For the first time in years, every number matched. We celebrated in the break room with cupcakes and coffee instead of champagne. It wasn't grand, but it felt real. That night, after everyone left, I walked through the office alone. The walls had new portraits, scientists, engineers, not executives. At the end of the hall, the empty hook where Lauren's picture once hung had been replaced by a framed quote from my grandfather: "Integrity is not inherited. It's chosen every day." I stopped and read it twice before turning off the lights. One morning in early January, a letter arrived at my desk. The handwriting was familiar, careful looping, almost elegant. It was from the correctional facility in Danbury. Inside, a short note: "I understand now why you didn't help me. I hope someday you'll understand what I thought I was fighting for. Tell Mom I'm sorry." There was no signature, just an initial. I folded it neatly and placed it back in the envelope. Some apologies I had learned didn't need a response to matter. That weekend I drove to the community center where my mother was completing her service hours. She was organizing donation bins, her hair tucked under a scarf. When she saw me, she froze. "I didn't think you'd come," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure I should." I helped her lift a box onto the shelf. For a while we worked in silence. Then she said Lauren wrote me. She says she's taking classes inside, trying to get her license reinstated one day. Her eyes glistened. "Do you think she can?" If she wants to, I said, simply. Mom nodded, staring at her hands. I was wrong about so much, she said, about what success looked like. About you. Her voice trembled. I wanted the world to see us as something special. I didn't see that we already were. I set the box down and met her eyes. The only thing that matters now is what we do next. She nodded, tears spilling freely. For the first time, there was no defensiveness in her face, just exhaustion and truth. That night, I returned home to the small apartment that had once felt temporary. It felt different now, like it belonged to me. On the kitchen shelf sat my grandfather's slide rule, the wood polished smooth from years of use. I ran my thumb over the markings and thought about the quiet way he lived, the patience he had for every answer that didn't come easy. A week later, the board approved a new initiative, one focused on ethics and mentorship for young scientists. We named it the Harold Bennett Integrity Grant. Daniel offered to fund the first 5 years, and I added my own salary bonus to match it. Your grandfather would be proud, Margaret said as we signed the papers. You've turned loss into legacy. On the day the press release went out, the company lobby filled with flowers and letters. Some came from hospitals we'd supplied during shortages, others from small startups we'd mentored. One note from a young researcher read, "Thank you for reminding us that honesty still wins." I pinned it on the office bulletin board where everyone could see it. That evening, as the building emptied, I stood by the window overlooking the river. The lights reflected across the water like broken glass mended back together. I thought about the long road it had taken to get here, the betrayals, the silence, the courtroom, the slow rebuild. Justice hadn't arrived with noise or vengeance. It had arrived quietly through patience, through work, through truth that didn't need to shout. I picked up my coat and turned off the lights. As I walked out, I passed the framed quote again, the one that now greeted everyone who entered, "Integrity is not inherited. It's chosen." I traced the glass lightly with my fingertips before stepping into the hallway. The elevator doors opened, and I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. Tired, yes, but steady. The kind of steady my grandfather had once believed I could be. Outside, the air was crisp with the first sign of spring. Tomorrow we'd launch the grant, publicly start interviews, and begin a new chapter for the company and for me. But for tonight, I let the quiet hold me, the kind of quiet that comes only after the truth has finally done its work. Spring arrived with soft air and long lights spilling through the glass walls of the office that had once felt so heavy. The first official grant recipients of the Harold Bennett Integrity Fund gathered in the lobby that morning, young researchers, interns, students just starting out. They looked nervous, dressed in borrowed blazers and hope. I shook each hand myself, remembering what it felt like to walk into a room where no one expected you to belong. Margaret stood beside me, clipboard in hand, her smile warm. "Your grandfather would have loved this day," she said. "He always believed the future was built one honest person at a time." I nodded my chest, tightening just a little. "He taught me that integrity isn't about perfection," I said quietly. "It's about doing the right thing when no one's watching." As we walked the new recipients through the labs, Dr. Pierce explained how the program would let them shadow senior scientists and pitch their own ideas. The excitement in their voices filled the space that had once been silent under fear. The company was thriving again, smaller, humbler, but cleaner. Every corner felt like a fresh start. After the event, Daniel joined me in the boardroom overlooking the river. The afternoon light reflected off the water in soft gold waves. "You've rebuilt something that should have fallen apart," he said, leaning on the table. "That's not luck. That's character." I smiled. It wasn't just me. Everyone who stayed made that choice. He studied me for a moment. Still, he said, "You're the reason it held together." Later that evening, I stopped by the community center where my mother was still serving out her hours. She was helping a group of older women organize clothing donations. Her posture straighter, her voice quieter than before. When she saw me, she hesitated, then gave a tentative smile. "They made me head of inventory," she said. "Apparently I'm good at keeping things in order." Her tone carried the faintest humor. I smiled back. "Maybe it runs in the family." We sat outside on a bench afterward, the sound of children playing drifting from the playground nearby. "I heard about the scholarship," she said softly. "It's a good thing, Nora. You're turning all that pain into something that helps people." She paused, searching for words. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll remember the best parts of me." I looked at her for a long moment. "I already do," I said, "but the rest will take time." She nodded, accepting that truth. It was the first honest peace we'd had in years. That night, I drove home with the windows down, the scent of rain in the air. My apartment was still the same quiet, uncluttered safe. On the shelf, my grandfather's slide rule sat next to a framed photo of the two of us in the old workshop. I'd had it restored from a damaged negative Thomas found in his files. In the picture, he's looking at me the same way he always did, with calm certainty that I'd find my own way, no matter how long it took. A few months later, an envelope arrived from the federal facility in Danbury. Inside was a simple note in my sister's handwriting. "I start teaching math to other inmates next week. It's the first thing that feels right in a long time." There was no plea for help, no excuse, just a small sign of change. I read it twice, then placed it inside the box with my grandfather's letters. Some beginnings I'd learned didn't look like redemption, they just looked like trying again. By summer, Bennett. Therapeutics had completed its first full year under new management. The company posted its strongest quarter in 5 years, but the celebration felt different this time, quieter, grounded in gratitude instead of vanity. The team gathered in the cafeteria with homemade food and laughter that didn't sound rehearsed. Dr. Pierce gave a toast. "To the ones who stayed honest," he said, lifting his glass. The room cheered, and for a moment I felt my grandfather's presence there, steady and proud. After everyone left, I walked the empty halls one last time that evening, the hum of the building soft and familiar. At the end of the corridor hung the quote that had guided everything: "Integrity is not inherited, it's chosen every day." The light from the exit sign reflected across the glass, and I smiled, knowing that for the first time the company truly lived by those words. When I stepped outside, the air was cool, carrying the scent of river water and magnolia trees. The city skyline shimmered against the night, and I thought of every moment that had brought me here. The rejection, the silence, the long years of being unseen. They had all led to this calm kind of justice, the kind that didn't roar but simply settled certain and complete. Life has a way of testing what we believe about ourselves. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't fighting back, it's standing still long enough to let the truth speak for you. My grandfather once said, "Patience isn't about waiting, it's about preparing for the moment when your time finally arrives." Now I understood what he meant. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or made to feel small, I hope my story reminds you that quiet strength has its own kind of power. Justice doesn't always come loud, it often comes through persistence, integrity, and grace. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that silence doesn't mean defeat. It can mean strength waiting for its moment.